Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the campus protests at Columbia University, the Ukraine aid bill shepherded through the House by Mike Johonson, and the Federal Trade Commission's move against non-compete clauses. I'm joined by Sohrab Ahmari, Power and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So many of us are recording this from New York. Sohrab, I know you went up to Columbia University in our lovely city and visited the campus protests. What did you see there?
First of all, getting in was kind of hilarious because, I was like, I'm going to write a piece about this on tight deadline. So I'll just have my wife and I, as we're dropping off our kids to school, afterwards, she'll just drive me by campus and I'll roll in, because if you've ever been to Columbia's campus, it's actually, I think, the best kind of college campus from my perspective are the ones where there is a distinct sense of a campus, but it's totally integrated into a larger urban environment. And so that there's this kind of openness and this interaction between city and university. So it's that kind of a campus. But unfortunately, in this case, I showed up and every entrance I'd normally use to slip into campus if I wanted to meet a friend there or whatever was blocked with, multiple NYPD officers up front. And then and the entire campus premises, just if you go around from Amsterdam to Broadway between 112th and 117th, 18th, whatever it is, it was ringed by cops of different varieties. It was the local, Columbia public safety officers who have the status of police officers, I believe. And then you have the NYPD. You had an NYPD helicopter hovering overhead, and you couldn't get in. So I used some, and they were like, well, if you want to get in, you have to get in touch with the media department. And the media department told me, yes, you can come in during a 2-hour window in the afternoon is when we let journalists view the freak show. So I used some tricks of the trade to get in, which I won't disclose. And yeah, I mean, it was, kind of the main thing that struck me is contrasted with the security presence outside with the helicopter overhead. And now, I mean, since I visited, there's the NYPD's anti-terror unit is moving into the campus. Contrasted with that, what's actually happening on, in the south lawn of the university, just under Butler, the beautiful Butler Library, is just I don't know. I didn't see it as this kind of, terror threat, that the way it's being treated, like a security threat. What I saw was mostly something that was most reminiscent, honestly, of Occupy Wall Street, which happened more than a decade ago. If you remember, there were tents. There was very clear demands, which I don't share all of them, or in fact any of them, but they were not crazy demands. We want divestment from Israel, within it, their own terms, right? It's within the logic of anti-Israel types on campus. It was to be expected. I don't share that, but that's what they were asking for. So, I know, to me, there was a jarring contrast between what I consider, frankly, and I wrote about this for the New Statesman, kind of a hysterical response from administrators, lawmakers in Washington, and what's actually happening. To me, it felt like a goofy left jamboree where they would do their, they do a morning sort of reveille, they get on and it's clap once if you can hear me, clap twice if you can hear me. And then it's we're going to have a drum circle in the art corner back there. We're going to have Palestinian dance. We need toothbrushes. And of course, all the signage, they had these community guidelines where they're we acknowledge that we are colonizing the land of the Indian peoples, or the native indigenous peoples who occupied the island of Manhattan before white colonization, and so on. So it was this combination of being saturated with human resources, HR vibes, and then the left jamboree quality of tents and chant call and response, which is a way they communicate in lieu of a mic, where one person says something and growing numbers of people repeat it so that the whole group gets to hear that. But it looks and sounds, it can look and sound kind of creepy. Last note before I shut up, because I know I gave a long description, but I spoke to one of the leaders of the movement who's now been profiled in the New York Times as well, a medievalist grad student named Grant Miner. And I asked him about allegations of anti-Semitism associated with the movement, and he categorically denied any such, and said the worst that anti-Semitism he's received is from hardcore kind of Zionist Jews who call him a Judenrat or a fake Jew or a capo. However, then I was walking around and I encountered what looked to be Orthodox Jewish students, like wearing suits but kippas as well. And I asked them, and they said, actually, we're not religious. We're just wearing this outfit because in solidarity with our more visibly Jewish friends who are halakhically barred from removing this clothing to blend in. We can blend in, but they can't. And some of the incidents they described, many of which have been corroborated by the wider media coverage and the footage you might find on the app formerly known as Twitter, is disturbing, right? One of them had heard himself, we are going to kill you. Oh, effing go kill yourself. Another, just because he presented as Jewish. Slogans like, we say justice, you say how, burn Tel Aviv to the ground, etc. So my point is not to deny that there's like some ugly rhetoric, some really ugly rhetoric going on, and that these people sully the Palestinian cause insofar as they do things like this. But I just didn't see like anti-terror conditions. That's the response from the university, local, and even federal authorities is as though you're dealing with a terror threat. And I think that's overblown and hysterical, and will not redound to the benefit of friends of free speech and free inquiry on campus, because we're getting one more set of like security checks when you get into campus, and like certain kinds of contentious speech will now be done under the watchful eyes of the NYPD anti-terror team. People who are on the other side of those protesters, I bet you we're going to regret it in the future, because every time we've had this kind of buildup of securitization and safety discourse, it stays and then it gets used against other people.
One thing that strikes me about the protests is not only their anti-Israel rhetoric, but the anti-American character of them, which is frankly of more immediate concern to me, since I'm American and not Israeli. Uh, as you alluded to, Sohrab, they regard the island of Manhattan, on which these protests are taking place, as unjustly settled or colonized space. It's becoming more and more common on the activist left to talk about Turtle Island or make these land acknowledgments. And one can reasonably ask, well, what's the point of all this? What will it result in? Variety of things. There's gathering momentum for reparations, economic policies more broadly that are redistributive, justified on racial lines. And then I think there's, basically anti-statist character to this. When you regard America as an unjust political entity, as established on a irredeemable basis and worthy in moral terms of overthrow, even if practically it has to be tolerated, you weaken any justification for state action that you don't happen to like. You can flout laws where you want. You can regard all exercise of force, say by police, as unjust. So it has kind of anarchic and libertarian character in certain ways, even as a decolonial program might justify other state programs like reparations. So I see in the rhetoric of this kind of campus left movement, not just an attack on the sort of history or ideals of America, but on the real kind of legitimacy of the state itself implicitly. And what will gain strength if the state is weakened? Well, the process will just continue that we've seen uh, for years, which is the growth of an NGO sector, which is also behind these protests to a considerable degree. So the state will be weakened, NGOs will be empowered, and uh, everything will get a little shittier, as I think you see, on campus, where the kind of normal functions of the campus aren't occurring. Uh, Classes are being suspended or taking place over Zoom. Graduation may be canceled. And so the disruption of daily life, the disruption of the normal functioning of our institutions will continue, and the strength of these counter institutions will grow.
Yeah, just to add to that, historically in the UK, we had huge student occupations around 2009, 2010, originally triggered by Gaza, but then quickly became about the student fee. They were student fee protests because the Tories were proposing to triple tuition fees, which eventually went through. Many places went into occupation. What was astonishing, I agree with Matthew here, what they actually became were sort of training grounds for the PMC, right? For the media class, for NGOs. Some of them, like UCL, University College London, were extraordinarily professionalized for student occupations. They were sort of very very stunningly organized. They had kind of media desks. They were very self-promoting. They did dances. It was like a whole thing, and really quite at odds with perhaps like a protest spirit. At the same time, a lot of institutions, Columbia included, as well as places like Goldsmiths and so on in the UK, really plug their revolutionary history, right? They talk about how these places are sites of historical political movements, and that they encourage almost like a kind of protest spirit and a revolutionary attitude. And they can't then be surprised if students then come and behave in ways that they imagine people used to behave in May 68 in Paris, or part of the civil rights movement and so on. So there's something kind of parasitic about these institutions' own histories. So both looking backwards and looking forwards to precisely rewarding and generating this class of people who want to participate in this kind of disruptive behavior, partly for existential reasons, partly even for reasons of future career. Something to put on your CV. I was part of this occupation. There's something kind of the issues aside, something very structurally strange about the role that these kind of movements play.
Yeah, something about the that I observed about the sort of NGOization. I mean, like in one sense, these kids are anti the state in the way that Matthew is talking about, but yet that's at a very kind of almost abstract level. They are against the American state, and yet, as far as the actually existing American state goes, which is not just our government and those sort of monumental buildings in Washington and in state capitals, but the state as it exists as a set of kind of interlocking institutions of corporations, the NGO sector, as Matthew mentioned, academe, etc. I would say these kids are very pro that state, or whether they're pro or anti is even besides the point. That they are deeply embedded in the kind of discursive practices of those institutions, and the actual practices, discursive and otherwise. And I made that point in the sense that they are, the sort of like, as part of their community guidelines, it's like we have to make sure everyone feels welcomed in this space. The land acknowledgments, et cetera, all have the quality of preparing you actually for state life as it actually exists, as opposed to state life as it is idealized in our picture of what the American state is as it actually exists, like those kinds of signaling that you want everyone to feel welcome, that this is a diverse space, we acknowledge land. That's also what you get, how you get ahead in like the boardroom of Johnson and Johnson or whatever. And so the and this is, I'm not challenging Matthew. I think that there are two things going on in parallel together. And in some ways, yes, they're getting uprooted now. In another way, they are asserting power and asserting, what institutionally they might, in which direction they might take institutions or have taken institutions already. So there's just this complexity. I can't quite delineate, like, because Matthew's definitely right that they are, against the American state as a kind of our political ideal, and they are disillusioned from all that. They see it all as impositions of power and white colonial power and so on and so forth. And at the same time, they know just how to operate in the actually existing state of NGO, corporate, academe, kind of interlocking institutions.
Speaker of the House Mike Johonson has gone from villain to hero, populist opponent of all that is good and decent because of his perceived opposition to bipartisan priorities such as Ukraine aid. But he's successfully pushed the aid through the House while getting the tacit support of one Donald J. Trump. Jeff, what's this say about the kind of worries about right-wing populism and its ability to overthrow the usual conduct of U.S. foreign policy?
It was interesting. Sohrab pointed me yesterday to a tweet by Michael Tracy, sometime Compact contributor, pointing to a report from the Wall Street Journal that Trump had strategized with Lindsey Graham, major hawk in the Senate, who, basically this was part of the process that kind of got Trump on board with finding a way of throwing his support behind this bill. And interestingly, the this report says that it was sort of Trump's idea, and part of what got him on board was this idea that the Ukraine aid would actually take the form of a loan that would have to be paid back at some point. And so I don't know. I mean, this. I must say I find it, I think there have been moments in recent months when, I've sort of been reminded of Trump's instincts on foreign policy often being pretty sound, right? That he interestingly, despite generally being a, stalwart sort of Israel supporter, he did make some remarks about just how awful what's going on in Gaza is and how it just has to stop. And I thought he at least has a kind of sound instinct here that that this situation is not sustainable. It looks very bad. Regardless of your sort of moral concerns about it, it's just bad for America. It's bad for America's image in the world. It's bad for America's ability to sort of have credibility. So anyway, on the other hand, I think this kind of pushed me in the other direction of being reminded of the ways in which Trump has shown himself to be often kind of a pushover to figures like Lindsey Graham, who are, Lindsey Graham is, in my view, one of the most nefarious and sinister people in Congress. Truly a sort of dangerous and terrible figure. And, being reminded of the fact that they sort of developed an alliance and have worked together on various things. And the fact that, this kind of, this sham of sort of, this supposedly being a loan is just indicative of the kind of way that despite his being, in some ways able to, negotiate effectively and, and be, somebody who has instincts that are at odds with the kind of, DC groupthink that can be salutary. He is also often manipulable, and it seems like he was sort of brought in on this whole ultimately quite terrible bill that will perpetuate these disastrous foreign policy situations for some years to come. And it's reminiscent of the way that I think, while for example, Christian Parenti argued effectively in our pages, that Trump did, you know in correspondence with some of his sort of sound anti foreign policy establishment instincts, show himself to be resistant to some of the groupthink around American empire. He did also often acquiesce and go along with what many of these figures wanted, and it's worth noting. One example of this is that he did actually contribute to the escalation of the situation in Ukraine, despite often being associated with, a more skeptical and conciliatory approach to that situation. He did send aid and arms to Ukraine that helped, escalate the confrontation with Russia and precipitate the invasion. So, I think it shows once again his very mixed record on these things, often having sound instincts that go against those of the sort of groupthink of the foreign policy blob, but at the same time, often being quite manipulable, being somebody who will end up cutting deals with totally insidious figures like Lindsey Graham, and who may actually not, as I would have hoped. And there are certainly times in the past year or two when I've thought, if nothing else, his coming back into office might lead to a resolution of some of these, quite disastrous situations, just because of his instincts being at odds with those that have led to their escalation. This kind of made me more pessimistic about that and made me think, yeah, he might actually end up being something of a pushover. So I don't know. I think it's quite discouraging, and it was interesting seeing some of the responses from sort of MAGA people to this Wall Street Journal report were to just simply claim that it's not true. To because in fact I think the general MAGA instincts are towards a more conciliatory approach to Ukraine, if not in some cases a sort of genuinely pro-Russia and pro-Putin stance, as often is alleged. Nevertheless, they a lot of people seemed unwilling to believe that Trump did ultimately go along and give his blessing to this legislation. So I don't know to what extent there's actually a potential for kind of tension and conflict within the sort of MAGA aligned movement. But just to return to your question, Matthew, I think it does show how ambiguous the sort of so-called populist threat is, and the limits of it, because it turns out that it's actually not that hard to get a critical mass of the sort of GOP populist fringe, including Trump himself, to go along with these forever war type commitments.
Yeah, to those who say that the journal report is false, I will say that my sort of gnomes in the populist right world have told me that Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene actually are quite angry about what they perceive as Trump giving cover to Mike Johonson to do this. The irony there, of course, is that it's all completely forgotten, but Mike Johonson is in the speaker's seat because Matt Gaetz and others objected to Kevin McCarthy, whom they saw as kind of an establishment figure who was going along prioritizing funding Ukraine over securing the border, which is true. And so there's some deeper point to be made about like Mike Johnson's transformation, which is all over the news, like in the Times every day, like why Mike Johnson changed his mind. But just the fact that somehow when you assume America, when you're elevated to the higher echelons of American power, seems like it's inescapable that you become a security apparat type guy. So I don't know why. I'm not interested in sort of psychoanalyzing Mike Johnson, but it's interesting. One is just very quickly that Geoff is absolutely right, because I wrote a gazillion Wall Street Journal editorials during the Obama administration, when I was much more of a conventional hawk, slamming the Obama administration for only providing things like blankets and ready-to-eat meals to the Ukrainians during the after the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the illegal invasion of the Donbass. I kept writing these editorials, and then Trump came, and especially what the Ukrainians wanted, and I would interview Ukrainian officials. They would say, we just want Javelin anti-tank missiles, which the Obama administration strenuously denied them. And then the Trump administration came along, and everyone in the kind of Anne Applebaum sphere was like, oh my God, Trump is going to abandon our allies. Trump is going to abandon Ukraine. And as a counter to that, Trump was the first to give. Trump did grant the Ukrainians precisely the Javelin anti-tank missiles that the Obama administration had withheld. In other words, Trump, contrary to the way he was seen as like this kind of figure who would upset the kind of Atlanticist worldview and Atlanticist priorities, was more determinedly in favor of it. By he was the one who actually gave serious arms to the Ukrainians that Obama would not. So that's just a point that Geoff is right on the kind of historical record. Last point, just about Lindsey Graham. I just want to, for our older listeners who may not know the meme of Representative Holden Bloodfeast, I think of Holden Bloodfeast whenever I hear the name Lindsey Graham, because the Holden Bloodfeast is an online meme. It's part of a group of bunch of memes that are that were made in 2018, making fun of various archetypes of lawmakers in Washington, and Holden Bloodfeast is one of them. And it's this kind of cartoonish image of an old person like connected to various tubes and a sort of electronic wheelchair device, and he just looks quite kind of grotesque. Although Lindsey Graham is not like that, but the description is Holden Bloodfeast, Iowa, Republican of Iowa, 118 years old. Please, God, let us nuke Iran. Nothing else matters. I'll do anything to please. I just want to see burning flesh one last time before I die. And then immediately following that, respectably bipartisan. I just think that. Anyway.
Subscribers to the New Center, Sohrab Ahmari's Substack, hosted by Compact Magazine, have learned that Sohrab Ahmari is a conservative. I take it this is a reference to Lina Khan, the head of the Federal Trade Commission, which has just articulated new rules barring non-compete clauses in employment contracts. Sohrab, explain yourself. Explain the genesis of conservatism.
Okay, I can't say I coined it. It's apparently a Washingtonian term of various right-wingers who are fans of Lina Khan, chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission. Before that, a very important congressional staffer on antitrust issues, wrote like one of the most important reports when she was a congressional staffer on big tech monopolies and how they threaten traditional media, became chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission at some obscenely young age, the sort of young age where when you hear it, I mean, she was like 26, I kid you not, the sort of thing I'm slightly exaggerating, it's probably not 26, but something close to that, where when you hear it, you think I should give up at life because Lina Khan is chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission at this young age. But so yes, very energetic person, and she just for me, reaffirmed why I consider myself in the ranks of the conservatives. There are others in Washington think tanks, figures like Oren Cass, our friend, and others who would be similarly described even if they don't adopt the label, because she just nuked what are called non-compete clauses in employment agreements, where what these are basically the employer can bar an employee upon taking a job, or even long after the employee has taken the job, from taking a different job at a competitor in the same industry. And what that does is it eviscerates workers' bargaining power, because it means that you cannot go to a different firm in the same industry and try to seek better wages or working conditions, because you are barred and can be sued for doing so. And it's the kind of maneuver by employers that gives the lie to the idea that labor markets are, all things being equal, are just sort of naturally optimally competitive, because each party can walk away from the other. So there's this symmetrical liberty of contract between both sides. Of course, that's not the case for all sorts of structural reasons, having to do with the fact that there are usually many more employees than there are employers. But beyond that, non-compete clauses make that even harder, because they explicitly bar you from seeking employment elsewhere. They create a monopsony, which is the reverse of a monopoly. And the concern with a monopoly is that there's one seller lording over many buyers. In a monopsony, there's many buyers lording over many sellers of labor power, and that's what's created by non-compete. Because when I hire XYZ person and I give them a non-compete, it just means that they can't work for anyone else by definition. So great move by the FTC, one of those kind of elements of the Biden administration that you can't help but cheer, just to show you how obscenely unfair these non-complete clauses can be. The agency, FTC, received obviously comment period comments from people. They invite, as they are trying to promulgate regulation, they ask the public to give comment, and one of them was this one. A person writes, an American worker writes, in October 2020, I started working as a bartender at a company called Redacted for $10 an hour. On my first day, I unknowingly signed a 2-year non-compete, slipped between other paperwork while my boss rushed me and downplayed its importance. At the bar, I was sexually harassed and emotionally abused. I needed money, so I searched for a new job while remaining at Redacted for 1 year. I was eventually offered a bartending job at a family-owned firm with better wages, conditions, and opportunities. Upon resigning, I was threatened with a non-compete I didn't know existed. Still, I couldn't take it anymore, so believing it was an unenforceable scare tactic, I did take the other job, thinking the legal system wouldn't allow a massive company with over 20 locations to sue a young entry-level worker with no degree. In December 2021, I was sued for $30,000 for, quote, considerable and irreparable damages for violating the non-compete. So, there is a fact that there are certain categories of expert employers where you think, okay, that kind of makes sense. You're dealing with a genius scientist who's developed a certain expertise only as a result in part of being at this firm. So, and this person makes like $400,000 a year at your firm. And it's reasonable to say, hey, sorry, we don't want you to take this kind of expertise you've developed and take it over to a competitor firm. That, I think there's some reasonable reasons for doing that. And in fact, the new regulation does carve out for situations like this. But now they're just, as that example shows, they're just being used against entry-level non-college workers, who have no other, no other way of sustaining themselves but selling their labor power for low wages. And you basically lock them into even lower wages or prevent their ability to compete in the free market of labor. So this puts kind of conservative libertarians or libertarian conservatives in a very difficult bind, because you cannot defend non-compete clauses in situations like that when you're not dealing with an expert employee making $400,000 a year, but a non-college person making $30K a year. You can't defend that on the face of it. So that what they'll try to do is say, well, okay, we're against non-compete clauses, but Congress should have done this, not the FTC. But sorry, like this, the interference with trade is squarely in the FTC's ambit. It's squarely within its mission. So I just don't see how legally such a challenge can be sustained, though you can bet that they will try to challenge it for that on the basis that it is, not within the FTC's regulatory authority to fix this problem.
Yeah, it was interesting to see people freaking out when you posted a picture of yourself meeting Lena Khan recently, and claiming that this proved you were a communist or something like this. I mean, it is quite fascinating that there is a fraction of conservative, sort of pro market or so-called pro market ideologues who will not only defend these kinds of blatantly anti-competitive practices on the part of businesses, but will claim that anybody who is critical of them is a communist, and that as soon as you do anything like this, you're on the slippery slope towards forced collectivization and God knows what else. And it's just it's kind of a remarkable situation.
Yeah. If I'm a communist, or Lena Khan is a communist, then so is Teddy Roosevelt, who was a big trust buster. Now you might say, okay, Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive, but guess what? William Howard Taft, who was definitely an old school conservative, brought twice as many antitrust actions under his administration than Teddy did. Actually, real actually existing communists dismiss antitrust as a petit bourgeois tool to protect, to protect small businesses that otherwise, are inefficient or whatever. So that's the idea that antitrust is socialist is so bonkers. It's actually a kind of free market liberal idea, and I have like disagreements with the extreme antitrust types who think that it's like a panacea. It's the one solution to all that ails our political economy. But they're certainly right that it's not a socialist solution. It's actually a market solution.
Well said. Just to underline that, you mentioned that antitrust, which, as you say, is in an important way a kind of laissez-faire idea. It's an idea about promoting competition. As you say, antitrust tends to advance a form of capitalist minimalism. Uh, you know, it's pro small business and thus pro petty bourgeois. And what is the one of the most important elements of the Republican base? Small businessmen, small property holders. So uh, I'm not sure that we're in the left lane passing all other cars on the road to serfdom because there's some antitrust action going on. It's, I think, really understandable that important figures, not just intellectuals, but senators, are interested in antitrust on the American right.
Yeah, JD Vance called Khan, the Lena Khan, the the only person in the Biden administration who's really doing her job. So, yeah, Vance is not a communist. The only other thing I would say that, again, for the small business element of this, one of the examples, one of the cases that the FTC studied is a guy who is all he knows, a non-college guy, all he knows how to do is a trade of power washing. And so, but he has a non-complete, which was imposed on him long after he actually was employed by his employer. He said, okay, if you show up to work the next day, you are under a non-compete, and if you don't agree, then you're out of a job. That's how it was imposed on him. Again, the free market ideal is that at that point he could then walk away and compete for another whatever job, but in fact he couldn't, because he found that every other power washer in the area also imposes non-competes, which means that he couldn't also start his own business, because that's what he really wanted to do, is start his own small. So it is actually, I mean, like, the kind of conservative thing we talk about, small business job creators, that's who's blocked, because establishment firms can all, in a way, informally collude by all imposing non-competes on would-be small businesses, against would-be small businesses.
Yeah, so I was just checking about the UK situation on non-competes. There is a version of it. It's not something that's kind of widely known, I think, because certainly the general perspective on low paid, low wage work is that it's flexible. People talk about everyone having to have 5 jobs these days. I myself worked for job agencies when I was a master's student. You certainly don't get any security or holiday pay. Like, in a way, your flexibility, quote unquote, which is the euphemistic way of putting it, is basically like saying, in a way, your only power is the fact that you're a free agent, as in free to leave, certainly not free to get any benefits or holiday pay or anything else. So yeah, it's strange to think about the idea of a job for life, but without any of the benefits, and in fact, the opposite of that. So yeah, they do exist. In fact, they have a slightly different name, I think, in the UK. Um, Something like competing business laws, like you can't work for somewhere if it's less than 10 miles away, and but they can usually only last, the restrictions, for like a few months, like 3 to 6 months apparently. So I don't think this is very widespread or well known in the UK. But yeah, I think it's I agree with Sohrab and Matthew in this case completely. Like the workers' rights are absolutely paramount here. This is not a question of the free market in that sense. Like, this is just very bad behavior by employers. End of story.
For more on the strange new ideology of conservatism, go to compactmag.substack.com and subscribe to the new center. That will also give you access to Blame Theory, all bonus content for Blame Theory, the new podcast hosted by Nina Power and Geoff Shullenberger. And as always, compactmag.com for all of our content.